So, good evening again. We are now at the almost last part of the introductions to the New Testament. From now on, after this class, we will have the individual books. We will talk about it. Okay, so before we do that, we asked ourselves in the last class, the question, how does one perform literal criticism? One simply asks questions of the text. Give you an example. Is the story we have, does it occur only once? If not, where else do we find a similar story, a similar text? It is always good to have similar texts compared to each other. There are certain rules in that. One of the rules is, first of all, you go and find out in the same book whether in the same book you find the same words, the same ideas, or even the same story. Like, for example, the feeding of the 5 and the 4,000. That's a similar story, same book. You can almost say same background, same audience. And so then you have a way of looking at the same people, at the same background, the same context. Of course, you will see that there is a difference between the stories, and there are a lot of similarities. In the similarities, you find some explanation. Of course, when you have differences, you have to highlight the differences, because otherwise you will make the mistake in saying that it's the same story, just told over and over again in the same book. But that's not the thing. That's not the issue here. The issue is that we are looking for the same stories or the same kind of stories. For example, the number of parables in the book of Matthew. You look at it and then you find a number of parables being taught in the book of Matthew. Or you find similar stories in the books of the same writer. I'm not saying it happens, but say, for example, you find a similar story of in the book of Luke, and you look for the same author, you end up with the book of Acts, and you compare the stories, and there are some issues are similar, but really same stories, that's another thing. There is also a possibility, and especially in the letters of Paul is writing to different places, to different people, but in some cases he is using the same material, the material background. We will talk about this when we come to the books and when we come to the specific letters, and we will compare those. But it happens, and in many cases, of course, you have similarities because the fact that Paul always wrote letters So that's already a similarity in general when you look at the different styles, even of Paul. Okay, how can you explain Paul having different styles in his letters? How come? How come we find that Paul is not saying the same things with the same wording? Well, there's one explanation. We touched on it before. That is that Paul worked with secretaries, amanuensis. That's the Greek word for secretary. And when you have another secretary, he may use other words. You know how dictating goes. Someone is dictating a text, or is dictating or speaking out his ideas, and someone is taking notes. That someone is the secretary. That secretary will write down what he hears in his own words. When you have two different people, you have two different wordings. So that is what's happening. That's why we have differences in the books of Paul. Of course, he writes to different people. Sometimes he writes to a church. Sometimes he writes to an individual. When you write to an individual, you tend to speak differently, especially when you know him. When you write to Philemon, and you speak about a certain thing you are or you were involved with, for example, with Onesimus. In that sense, we see, and again, that is important, we see the personal touch, but the personal touch goes through a secretary. So you see, even if you have letters written to Timothy, to Philemon, although you know that they are written to a certain person, not so much about a group, but a certain person, of course, they can use the letter because both Timothy and Philemon are pastors of churches. And so what we see is that there are similarities in this. Similarities between books from the same writer. You have also, for example, Peter writing different letters to the similar group. John is writing 1, 2 and 3 John to, well, more or less a group of people. One, you can say probably one is specifically written to a person, but still it is being used in churches to be read, to be explained. So that's the first thing you have to do when you see same thing happening. It is in case of the same person, for example, the same writer. Or, and that's the other possibility, that two different people speaking about the same issue. For example, in the Gospels, we find 4 times a story about the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All those stories are a little bit different, but they have the same line, even the same timeline. So there are similarities and there are differences, and you can understand what is happening. You can understand it good, or you can understand it better if you take all 4 accounts, 4 stories into account as such. So that is something we have to be able to look at. So we have this the stories, the same stories in different books, or we have the same author of different books, and then you have the same issues. When you have a certain thing you talk about, let's say grace. Okay, in the book of Romans, Paul speaks about grace, but he also speaks about grace in the book of Ephesians. So there is a link in between. Or, for example, you have the story in Ephesians 6 when you have the image of a soldier, and then the different parts, the helmet and the breastplate and the sword and so on. But that is not unique. That's not only not unique to Paul, it is unique in the New Testament almost, but it's not completely unique, because he is repeating and using those materials in other places, and that is not new. Paul was borrowing, in a certain sense, from an emperor in Rome, Caligula, and Caligula presented himself in a certain way. And I don't know whether Paul was listening or whether Paul came to know what Caligula was saying, but Caligula is actually using the same wording as Paul. So and Caligula lived before, died before Paul. That's what we know. Paul's ministry was still ongoing when Caligula was already dead. The same thing goes with, for example, the Emperor Nero. He called himself God and he called himself Lord. Well, similarities with Jesus? Okay, well, this is the negative similarities. But the possibility exists that you have similarities in other places or in other parts of the New Testament. So it is good to have all this knowledge in the background. So we have to look for similarities, we have to look for differences. We have to look for the same story or the same ideas, or in some cases, similar wording. There are certain things being said in a certain way in different books by different writers, but also in different books by the same writer. For example, Paul speaks about the apostleship. Of course, Matthew speaks about apostleship. Luke speaks about the apostleship. John speaks about the apostleship. So there's a whole range of people speaking about that specific issue. You cannot, let me say that again, you cannot take one verse out of it somewhere and saying that is what it is. For example, that's what a number of people are doing with a text in Ephesians 4, verse 11. They are claiming a lot of things just with this text. You can't do that, because in the same text, in the same letter of the same author, some of the materials are repeated. So if you want to know what it means, you go to the same author, you go to the same text, to the same letter in this case, and then you understand. There are certain rules applicable, so we have to take the rules and apply them before we can go on and say this is what it means. We have to be aware of the fact that those rules are still valid. Okay, now another thing we have to look for is this segment of text explaining something that is already being said. That can be being said in the same book, in the same chapter even, or can go out of in other books and again with the same writer, or in other books from another writer, another author. The final author is always God, it's always the Holy Spirit. So when that happens, the Holy Spirit is probably saying something on parallel lines. But when you go back in time, you will find that the parallel lines we find are not always parallel in time. Sometimes there's a time difference, and then you have to have a way of looking at it, saying, okay, this is what it meant here and there, but then this happened, and then there's another thing. I will give you an example. There are letters written before the destruction of the temple. There are letters written after the destruction of the temple. Guess what? They are different. Well, that's quite normal because there's a whole thing happening. The temple in Jerusalem is being destroyed. Jerusalem is being destroyed. The nation of Israel is in discordance, and it's in the diaspora now. So it is being spilled out to the rest of the world. They are fleeing from everywhere to everywhere. So not only the Jewish people, because the Romans didn't make so much of a difference between the Jews and the Christians. So for them it was like, that's Jewish sect, so that's the same group. Of course not, but okay, well, that's what happened. They knew, on one hand they knew, on the other hand they were trying to get rid of people in Jerusalem. And so the people in Jerusalem, they fled. Both the Jews and the Christians. But not only in Jerusalem, because not only Jerusalem fell, because you go down south and you go to Masada. Masada fell too. So there is more than just a coincidental evidence of similarity. So when you read something, in many cases, that is being said already. Like, for example, we took the examples of miracles that happened in the Old Testament and happened in the New Testament. There's a whole range of material which is very similar in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. That is not to say that the people are doing wrong things, or the writers are doing something that they should not be doing. Like I said before, copyright I was never heard of. And many ideas, even Jesus is repeating things that are happening in the Old Testament. Even when he speaks about "I'm the light of the world," he's actually referring to something that happened in the between time between the Old and the New Testament. So it's not only the Old Testament he's using, it's also using things that were known to the Jewish people at that time, specifically during the time between the Old and the New Testament. So he was actually talking about something that happened a few hundred years before. They knew, he knew. And that is again, that's very important. Important for all of us to understand that Jesus was a Jew. He lived among the Jews. He lived under the law. Let me say it this way. It may sound a little bit strange, actually. Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus was a Jew. He was a Jew of the nation of the Jews. He was a Jew of the religion of the Jews. So it was both nation and religion. And he lived in a Jewish country called Israel. So it is, again, something we have to take on in our mind when we speak about Jesus. Remember, when Jesus was born, that's not when the New Testament started. The New Testament started when Jesus died. So it means that all things that happened before in the story of the Gospels is always, and that is important, is always the story of the fact that Jesus lived under the law. And that is what the Sadducees and the Pharisees are actually pushing. They are more or less saying, well, what are you telling us? We know you are under the law because you're a Jew. There's no new religion. There are cults and sects of Judaism, but they are not. That is not what Christianity is all about. But to understand Jesus and to understand what he's saying, how the apostles are reacting. Remember, that the apostles were only given the Holy Spirit at the end of the book of John. That's right before the end, the explanation, and that's before the book of Acts started. And important with that is that at that time, when you have to look for clues, when is that happening? And then you have three parts. You have one part in John, you have one part in the book of Luke, and you have one part in the book of Acts. All three of them are together. And then we know that Jesus rose from the dead, and at the same day he appeared to the apostles. Thomas wasn't there, and then he appeared again a week later. He rose from the dead on a Sunday, and he came back to the same church on the next Sunday. That is 2 Sundays in a row. The first Sundays after the resurrection, Jesus went to church. You can almost say that. So that's why we celebrate Sundays. We do not worship the Son, we worship the Creator of the Son. So there are similarities, there are differences, there are things that are being explained in different places. You cannot give a good explanation of anything except if you understand that things are being said in different places. There's hardly anything to find in the New Testament that is not being touched on by someone else. Or, let me say it this way, that is someone else is talking about. So that means we have to look for it. Of course we can find, for example, there's a book called The Concordance, and in the Concordance you can find those materials. Whether you put that on the net or whether you have a real book like the Strong Concordance, a book that thick, that big, and with thousands of materials in there. It's one text after the other. I don't know exactly how many pages, at least 1,000 pages thick, only references. You find the names, you find the dates, you find the things that happen, money-wise, names of people, names of places, you name it, it's in the book. So that's a good thing to start with. When you have something you want to say, you want to know, you go back to that specific, what we call the concordance. That is because we like to know where something else was said about the same thing we are talking about now. Number 3, does the style of this passage reflect the same style as the surrounding passages? Why is this important? Well, remember I said that there are a number of places in the books, in the letters, where you find, for example, a prayer. A prayer has a different structure than a plain text. Or a hymn. A hymn has a different structure than a prayer, and has a different structure than the plain text. I mean, of course we know that, but do we take that into account? Do we know, in the sense that we are using it, so our explanation of a certain text somewhere gets supported by more arguments? And that's what I would like you to do, to build up strongly so that your explanations of what you are saying is not just shouting. We are usually saying, and that's from the course of homiletics. We would like to have more Bible and less shouting. More Bible and less shouting. That's what we want in our sermons. Why do we shout? There's no reason to shout. A sermon is not a shouting. A sermon is an explanation of a Bible verse. So, why shout? You don't have to shout. Of course, in some cases you do to make something clear, or you repeat something to make something clear. Do you have to repeat it all the time? Of course not, but you do that so that people know what you were talking about. That's what I'm doing now, so that you will know things are important. When you look at the context, when you look at the passage, see the difference between one passage and another, even in the same book, even in the same chapter. Not all the chapters are the same. Like Mary is praying in the book of Matthew, okay, then you have that prayer. You have a prayer in Ephesians 1. You have a prayer. You have a hymn. Okay, you have a hymn. In the book of Deuteronomy, there is the hymn of Moses, and Moses is saying things. You can almost say Moses is singing things that are difficult to say. So there is more to the text than just what you hear, what you read. There's something behind, and that's what we have to look for. When we know that, then we have a good sermon. Then we have a good reason to bring something the people have never heard before. That's great. That's unique. That's the thing we are looking for in our sermons. That's what I try to convey to you. We talked about chronology, remember? Is the text explaining a chronological issue? Chapter 1 of Matthew. Yeah, it is explaining something. It's not just saying this happened and this happened and this happened. Let me give you the example of Matthew 1. And please, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just giving some idea. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Sarah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. And so on. Anyway, so you have a whole range, and it is arranged in a certain way. This is not to say that that's the only people that lived at that time, and it's not the only people that were part of the genealogy. These are just names, and sometimes it says it's the father, but it can be the grandfather or even the great-grandfather in one particular instance. So there is more to it than just the names, and then you have various names that are very famous, like, for example, Zadok. Well, of course he is there. You have the father of Jacob in verse 16 of Matthew 1 is not a Jacob, the archfather, and Jacob is the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. So Joseph's grandfather, Jesus' grandfather was Jacob. So when you say Jesus is the son of Jacob, you're right, because he is. Well, he's the grandson, but he's still the son. That means a descendant from. So you can have a whole range of explanations here, and of course be aware of the fact that not everyone is mentioned. So it's very difficult to look for numbers in that area, because it's arranged according to a certain way. We are going to go into that again when we come to the book of Matthew. But it's a chronological thing. When the critics ask this question, that is something that's again important. In a sense, it's important for us that critics are not asking these questions just to make themselves interesting to other people. They are asking the questions to dig deeper, not to tear down or tear apart the Bible. Rather, they are trying to understand the text as it is. Let me say that again. They are trying to understand the text as it is. They are trying to find as close as possible, going back as far as possible into the text, so to find the closest possible text to the original. This is, as one might suppose, a very important part of understanding the Bible. So, again, this is not just something part of a course. This should be part of your life. Okay, let's look at a small other thing before we close this part, before we go to the different books. There are a number of words we are using to describe texts in the Bible. For example, we have the word parable. What is a parable? What is a figure of speech? What is an image? What is a metaphor? Okay, let's start with the last thing I mentioned. What is a metaphor? Let's go to the book of Psalms. A metaphor in Psalms 18. Psalms 18, verse 2. Let me read it. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. That's a metaphor. It's all right. I mean, everything that is being said is right. There's nothing wrong with it. But literally, God is not my fortress. Literally, God is not my rock. Because if I stand on a rock and I say this is God, then I'm damning the wrong religion. Because that can be Hinduism, saying that everything is God. And that's not what we are talking about here. God is my rock. It's not physically I'm standing on the rock. And the rock is God. I'm holding the fortress. Not literally. I don't have a fortress that I can defend. I take refuge. Well, I only take refuge if I'm persecuted or followed by someone who wants to kill me or wants to do harm to me. So I take refuge. Well, of course not literally, and that's the idea with metaphor. In Revelation 21 we have Jesus saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Well, I don't know, but I've never seen anyone writing down an Alpha and an Omega and saying this is Jesus. Because that's what Jesus said. You know, it is not literally meant. It is a metaphor. It has things we understand, things that are important to us, things that are shaping us as a believer, but they are not literal. They are metaphorical. Another thing we sometimes hear, well, sometimes actually there's a lot people talk about, and that is in Ephesus 6 verses 10 to 20. They are talking about the armor of God. We just mentioned it. I just mentioned it. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God. Okay, so God has an armor, and He gives it to me, and I put it on. No, that's not what He says. So it's in one sense metaphorical. In another sense, it's spiritual. So this is a spiritual issue. We are putting on in our battle, which is not a battle against flesh and blood, but is a battle against authorities, powers. Are the powers real? They are real. Listen to me, they are real. But I'm not taking literally a sword and going fight them. I'm not taking a gun and shoot them. Okay, I'm not bombard them with bombs and grenades and so on. No. This is spiritual warfare. Let's look at another text in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 4 and 5. The weapons we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments, that's the explanation. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So we are talking about real things, but not physical things, spiritual things, spiritual warfare. That's what we are talking about. We looked at metaphor, we looked at spiritual warfare. Let's look at allegory. Allegorical issue, thing. Okay, that is a figure of speech. I'm saying something, but it has a different meaning than the literal translation of my words. When I say I'm in love with my wife, I'm not lying, but there's nothing in for you. When I say I love the world, I'm not saying I love the sinful world, but I like the creation of God. So another thing is, at the end of the world. That's a figure of speech. It's not literal. There's no end to the world. Well, time-wise there will be, but literally, when you take off here and you go around the world, after 40,000 kilometers you're back here. So there's no end, because the end is, well, let me say it. This is where it begins. Okay? This is where it begins. So that's where you go to. Eventually, I will go around completely and come here. Okay, you see, that's where it begins, that's where it ends. same place. So there are no ends to the world. But let us look at some text. The book of John, remember, he had this wonderful way of comparing things, like light and darkness. That's one of the things he compared. But let us look at John the chapter 10, speaking about, allegorically, about sheep. First of all, he says, you are a sheep. Well, of course, I'm not really a sheep. He's the shepherd. Well, he's not really the shepherd, because there are no, I mean, I'm not a sheep like a sheep is a sheep, but let me say it allegorically, I'm a sheep. I'm not spiritually a sheep, I'm allegorically a sheep. So Jesus is the shepherd, the good shepherd. Is he literally a shepherd? No. His great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather David, that was a literal shepherd. He worked at the meadow with the sheep, so he was a shepherd. That idea of the shepherd is taken over in the New Testament and is being explained by Jesus about the good shepherd and the sheep. Is he talking literally about sheep and good shepherd? No. He's actually talking about the church is our sheep. And the sheep need a shepherd. Who is the shepherd? Well, locally, that's the pastor. Internationally, for all times, that's Jesus. So, that's what he is talking about. That's behind the whole idea. So Jesus is the shepherd. There is when you look at it, when you look at this story in this chapter, from verse 1 to say 16, you will find that Jesus is the shepherd, but there's a hidden meaning. And the hidden meaning is talking about the church, his church. But that is also his body, because he's the head. Okay, that you see, that's allegorically. Is he literally the head? And no, he's not literally the head. He's spiritually, in the authoritative way, he is the head, and we are the rest of the body. So there is a hidden meaning, and then you have parables. Parable is what you can say, it's analog to reality. It's not purely talking about reality, but it's analog. It means, literally, it's new word. So it's the same thing with, let me say it in English, we say with other words. Well, that's analog. So we have analog, for example, and that's probably the best way of looking at the story itself and then understanding it. It's the story of the prodigal son. We know the story. I mean, we have a rich family, and they have a whole range of material goods, and the youngest son wants to take up his inheritance before his father dies and before something else happened. If the father can't work anymore, the oldest son will take over, and the youngest son will be given. If there are only 2 children, then it will be something like 1/3 of the estate. So that's probably the part the son got. We don't know how long it took him to spend it all. We know it was a sinful thing, and we know he came back. Poor, stinking, unable to support himself, unable to be the father's son as he wanted to be. And so there's the whole range of things you can find out for yourself, and you can look at the real world, and you can find certain things in the real world saying similar things. We have a lot of people, young people run away from home because they think they can run their own life in a better way as they can do within a family. And in some exceptional cases that may be true. In reality, the majority of them run away because they think they can have more freedom or whatever. There is a word that's being used in Dutch and in French. It's called kot. It means a place where you go to live on your own. A student will have to go to a kot to study. So that's what many people try to do. Many people try to avoid to live under the rules and the laws of a family, and then they spend a lot of money, sometimes the money of the family, for things they don't have to have anyway, but they think they need it, and so they are getting it. Okay, well, when you get it, that's fine. There's no problem getting it. It's a problem spending it, and that takes some time. And then, when all the money is over, you come back to your family, say, with open hands, with closed minds, sometimes with closed hearts, and that's probably the worst thing that can happen. But that is happening, and so we see that certain people think they can go their way, and that's what the parable is trying to explain. So it's not something that really happened, and it's not something that really happens now, but it gives the example, the line to live on. It's not a timeline, but it's a way of doing things. When you go against your family, it's bound to happen that you lose everything you have, and eventually you have to come back, and you almost have to beg for attention. And in some cases the family will give you the attention, and sometimes they don't. In the story here with the prodigal son, the father is waiting until his son comes back. Whatever the son did is not important for the father. It's important for the brother. The family is always more or less on a different level than mother and father. So the father is waiting for the son, and the son comes back, having nothing anymore. That is specifically a parable. So we had a metaphor, we had spiritual warfare, we had the allegory, remember, the figure of speech, and then we had a moral lesson, moral lessons in the parables. Of course, then you have also images. The New Testament is using a lot of images to make sure that we understand what we are the New Testament is painting an image, for example, about sanctification, is painting an image about salvation, about forgiveness, about hope, about love, without even, in some cases, not even mentioning the word itself, but it's speaking about it. You can say in the back of the mind of the person who is writing it, he had that in mind, and the Holy Spirit was leading and guiding him so that he could write it, so that the people would understand it. So I hope you had a good time, and I hope you understood what I was talking about, and I hope you will have a different way of looking at the Word of God from now on, and studying it in a different way as you did in the past. God bless you.